After everything we've talked about, after the question of what happens if Nigeria breaks apart, there's one scenario people can't stop thinking about. What if Biafra actually becomes a country? Not a protest, not a movement, but a real nation. Would it bring freedom, or open the door to something even more complicated? Imagine waking up to a message that doesn't feel real. At first, it looks like one of those viral posts, something people share without confirming. But this one feels different. It's everywhere. Social media, radio, conversations in the street. The same words keep repeating. Biafra has been declared. At first, people hesitate. Nigeria has seen many moments of tension before, many bold statements that didn't lead to permanent change. So the reaction begins with disbelief. But then, it becomes clear. This time, it's not just a declaration. It's a transition. And in that moment, something shifts, not just in the southeast, but across the entire country. Because for decades, the idea of Biafra has existed as a memory, a movement, a conversation shaped by history, especially the Nigerian Civil War. That period left a deep imprint on how people understand identity, unity, and division. Now imagine that history moving from memory into reality. The first reactions would be emotional. For some, it would feel like a long-awaited moment. A sense of fulfillment, of recognition, of identity becoming official. There would likely be celebrations, people gathering, expressing relief, feeling like something significant has finally happened. But for others, the reaction would be very different. Because when a country changes, not everyone experiences it the same way. Some would feel uncertainty. Questions would rise immediately. What does this mean for us? What happens to our lives? Where do we belong now? Because beyond the idea of a new country lies something more complex: transition. Creating a nation is not just about declaring it. It's about building it. And that process begins immediately. Borders would need to be defined clearly. Governance structures would need to be established. Leadership would need to move from symbolic to operational. And that's where reality begins to take shape. Because movements are driven by ideas. But countries are sustained by systems. Everything that people rely on, security, infrastructure, economy, law, must be organized. And that does not happen overnight. At the same time, Nigeria itself would be reacting. Because the creation of a new country does not just affect the region that separates, it affects the entire nation it separates from. Political discussions would intensify. Decisions would need to be made about recognition, cooperation, and future relations. And those decisions would shape what happens next. Because the relationship between Nigeria and a newly formed Biafra would be critical. Would it be cooperative? Tense? Uncertain? And beyond that, the international community would begin to respond. Some countries might move quickly to recognize Biafra. Others might hesitate. Some might take strategic positions based on their own interests. Because global politics plays a role in how new nations emerge and stabilize. So while the idea of Biafra becoming a country may feel like a clear moment, in reality, it would open the door to a complex series of events. And that is where the real story begins. Now imagine the days after the declaration. The excitement is still there, but it begins to shift. Because once the moment passes, reality sets in. And reality asks a simple but powerful question. How do you build a country from the ground up? The first challenge would be governance. Who leads? How is power structured? What kind of system is created? Because leadership during a movement is not the same as leadership in a nation. A movement can rally people around a shared idea. But a nation requires organization, decision-making, and long-term planning. And those responsibilities are much more demanding. Then comes the economic question. How does Biafra sustain itself? Every country needs a functioning economy, systems that allow people to work, trade, produce, and grow. Resources would become a central focus. What assets are available? How are they managed? How are they distributed? Because economic stability is not just about wealth, it's about structure. It's about creating systems that people can rely on. At the same time, infrastructure would need attention. Roads, power supply, communication systems, public services. These are the foundations of daily life. And building or restructuring them requires planning, investment, and time. Then there is the issue of currency. Would Biafra create its own? Would it adopt an existing one? How would it manage inflation, trade, and financial stability? Because financial systems are delicate. They depend on trust. And trust takes time to build. Then comes the human dimension. People would need clarity. Clarity about identity, rights, movement. Because in a situation like this, individuals are not just observers, they are participants. Their lives are directly affected. And their confidence in the system determines how stable that system becomes. At the same time, the relationship with Nigeria remains important. Trade, movement, communication. Because even after separation, connections do not disappear instantly. And how those connections are managed can either support stability or create tension. So while the idea of a new nation may begin with excitement, it quickly becomes a test. A test of planning. A test of leadership. A test of unity. Because building something new is always more difficult than imagining it. And that is where the real challenge lies. Now fast forward. Weeks turn into months. Months turn into years. The initial excitement has settled. The systems are in place, or at least, they are evolving. And now the question shifts again. What does the future look like? Because the long-term outcome of a new country depends on multiple factors. Stability, leadership, economic growth, public trust. If those elements come together, the country can grow. It can develop. It can create opportunities. But if they do not, challenges can increase. Because every nation faces difficulties. The difference lies in how those difficulties are managed. For Biafra, the future would depend on decisions made in the early stages. How governance is structured. How resources are managed. How relationships are handled. Because those early decisions create patterns. And patterns shape outcomes. At the same time, the global environment plays a role. International partnerships, trade agreements, diplomatic relations. Because no country exists in isolation. And the ability to connect with the world influences growth. But beyond all of that, there is something even more important. Identity. Because creating a country is not just about systems. It is about people. About how they see themselves. How they connect to the idea of the nation. How they contribute to it. Because in the end, a country is not defined only by its borders. It is defined by its people. Their actions. Their beliefs. Their commitment to building something that lasts. And that is the real question. Not just what happens if Biafra becomes a country, but what kind of country it becomes. So now imagine it again. The announcement is made. The celebrations begin. A new flag rises. And the world watches. But the real story doesn't start with the declaration. It starts with what comes after. So tell me, do you think Biafra becoming a country would solve problems? Or create new ones? Drop your honest opinion in the comments. And if you want more deep, powerful, and thought-provoking stories like this, hit subscribe, because the future of Africa is still being written, and you don't want to miss what comes next.